There are worlds in the Imperium that do not fall with fire or with steel, but with rot. They are not conquered in a single night of battle, nor are their names erased in the blinding light of They are drowned slowly, their skies thickening with spores, their rivers clotting into stagnant filth, their people coughing themselves hollow until the only thing left is decay. This is how Nurgle, the plague god, claims his dominion, not through swift destruction, but through the patient undoing of every breath, every heartbeat, every blade of grass. To witness such a fall is to watch life itself betray its own shape, until all that remains is a parody of endurance. These are the stories of worlds lost to the grandfather of pestilence, worlds that did not burn, but rotted from within. If the thought of such unmaking grips you, and if you want to see more of how the galaxy's most terrible truths unfold, then remember to like, share, and subscribe. Your support ensures these stories continue to spread, much like the plagues we describe, seeping into every corner of the Impreth. The world of Corythus had always smelled of smoke and oil. Its skies were the color of bruised iron, thick with the exhalations of the manufactura that stretched for miles across its plains. To live there was to breathe poison, and so the people were used to coughing, a rattle in the chest, a tightness in the lungs. These were the inheritance of every Hab-born child. No one remembered a time when the air had been clear. That was why, when the first cough came, no one noticed. It was nothing unusual. It was as ordinary as the rumble of the conveyor lines, or the endless tolling of the shift-bells. The first man to fall ill was a loader in Habstack 17, a broad-shouldered worker named Dresk. He had carried crates heavier than most men could lift, his back bent like steel under pressure. He coughed one morning and spat black mucus onto the floor of the Hab. His overseer mocked him for weakness and sent him back to work. By the evening, he had a fever, but still he labored, for on Corythus, a man who missed a shift lost his ration. His family could not afford hunger. The following day, Dresk's skin had broken out in a rash of small boils, red and itching, dotting his forearms like blisters from fire. He wrapped him in cloth and said nothing. The Medicae in the Hab block were already overburdened with lung rot and broken bones, and besides, he feared what would happen if his overseer thought him unfit for labor. So Dresk continued. He coughed, and those around him coughed with him. It spread quietly. No alarms sounded, no sirens blared. This was not an invasion with lasguns and bombardment. It was a whisper, a presence slipping through meals shared in cramped kitchens, through children huddling close in the cold, through the sweat of men packed tight in manufactura lines. Soon, Habstack 17 was alive, with sound every corridor filled with the chorus of lungs, straining against something they could not expel. People told themselves it was nothing. The air was always bad. Winters always brought sickness. The Emperor had blessed them with resilience, and resilience was what kept Corythus alive. By the second week, the Arbites, who patrolled the manufactura districts, were reporting disturbances. Not riots at least not yet, just unease. Too many families were begging for aid at the precinct gates, demanding medicine that was not there. Too many voices were raised at ration lines, claiming the water tasted strange, that food spoiled before it could be eaten. Strange rumors began to crawl through the Vox channels, that insects were hatching inside walls, that infants were born with gray skin, that the refuse pits swarmed with flies, even in the depths of cold season. The administratum ignored such reports. Pest control was the duty of the Habmasters. The tides had to be met, and the ledgers showed no disruption to production quotas. What was a cough compared to the endless needs of the Imperium? Yet the whispers would not die. In the shrines of the Emperor, priests raised their voices louder, urging repentance, demanding that the faithful scour their souls for weakness. To them, every sickness was a sign of impurity, a test of will sent by the master of mankind. The sermons grew fevered, urging the congregation to resist despair, To punish those who spoke of unseen evils. To question was to blaspheme. To doubt was to fall. And so the people of Corinthus swallowed their fear as best they could. They worked, they prayed, they coughed. It was not until children began to vanish that the silence broke. Parents reported them missing from the habstacks, their sleeping mats empty, their toys left scattered on the floor. Some claimed the children had wandered off, delirious with fever. Others whispered that something had taken them, something that left behind trails of slime in the dark, something that buzzed with wings too large to belong to any insect of the world. Arbites investigated, but their numbers were few, and their task endless. To them, disappearances were as common as theft. Desperation made people flee into the wastes. Starving families sometimes sold their own young into bondage. What were a handful of missing children compared to the riots that now threatened at every ration hall? The first riots came on the 32nd day after Dresk's cough. Habstag 17, overwhelmed by the sick, turned into a charnel house. Families dragged their loved ones to the street to beg for aid, but no aid came. The Arbit sealed the doors, claiming contamination, and those within burned their own dead in improvised pyres. Thick smoke choked the avenues, and through the smoke came flies, swarming in such numbers that the air shimmered with their wings. No one knew where they came from. They crawled from cracks in ferrocrete, spilled from broken drains, gathered in black clouds that blotted out the dim sun. The Arbites reported it as vermin infestation. The priests claimed it was a punishment from the emperor. But those who had seen the boils on their skin, who had watched their neighbors rot alive while still breathing, knew better. It was then that the first whispers of Nurgle were spoken aloud, not in public, not in shrines or vox announcements, but in hushed voices in the shadows of Hab corridors. The plague god, they said, had set his eyes upon Corinthus. The grandfather had reached out with his rotting hand and touched their world. For some, the words were blasphemy. For others, they were the only explanation that made sense of the horror now eating its way through their lives. And still the Administratum wrote nothing but numbers. Production quotas fell, but not enough to warrant intervention. The Tide Masters adjusted their ledgers, lowered projections, reassigned work quotas. Reports to Terra spoke of minor unrest, seasonal illness, manageable decline. By the time any true alarm would be raised, it was already too late. The capital city of Corinthus had once been a monument to imperial endurance. Its spires jutted above the smoke like jagged spears, crowned with the double-headed Aquila, watching over manufactura shrines, and the ceaseless tide of workers that filled its avenues. Now those same streets stank of rot. The plague had outgrown the habstacks, where it first bloomed. It had seeped into water cisterns and aqueducts, into grain shipments and protein vats. Whole districts reported that their food spoiled before it could be consumed, turning slick with slime, crawling with maggots. The water from fountains tasted of metal and blood, and everywhere, the coughing, always the coughing. Hospitals overflowed first, the Medicae already pressed to their limits by the brutal cost of industrial life, found themselves drowning in a flood of the fevered and the dying. Their wards stank of pus and burning incense. Prayers thick in the air as priests walked the aisles, reciting litanies of purity. Families carried their kin to the gates only to be turned away, and those turned away collapsed in the streets. Swelling the piles of bodies that grew day by day, Administratum, scribes, ink-stained and sleepless, tried to keep pace with the rising death teeths, scratching numbers into data slates faster than promethium could be burned in the manufactura furnaces. But numbers no longer meant anything. The ledgers filled with zeros, each column of digits a quiet admission that no order, no tithe, no bureaucratic structure could contain what was happening in the ecclesiarchy halls. Sermons thundered with desperate ferocity. The priests declared the plague a test of faith, a scourging meant to cleanse the weak from the strong. They demanded fasting, self-flagellation, and public penance. Whips cracked against bare flesh in the open squares as thousands knelt in unison, blood mingling with phlegm and sewage beneath their knees. The air was alive with chanting, but the voices grew thinner with every passing day. For each penitent who cried out to the emperor, 2 more choked on their own bile. The priests promised salvation through endurance, but endurance offered nothing except more suffering. The Arbit's garrisons, once feared for their absolute discipline, began to fracture. In the early weeks they enforced quarantines with brutal precision, sealing entire hablocks and executing those who tried to flee. But soon their numbers fell to the same coughing fits as the civilians. Enforcers collapsed inside their precinct houses, their armor clattering to the stone floors as their bodies swelled with fever. Patrols dwindled and then ceased altogether. Some Arbits, abandoning all pretense of order, fled into the countryside, hoping the open plains would spare them the disease. Others locked their doors and prayed to outlast it. The sound of Arbite shotguns, once the iron heartbeat of law, vanished from the streets. The Astra Militarum regiments stationed for deployment fared no better. Sealed within their barracks while awaiting transport off-world, they were left to rot in their own sweat and fear. The infection moved among them faster than in the city beyond. Soldiers, trained to fight orcs or heretics with less fire and bayonet, could do nothing against the fever that claimed them one by one. Commissars tried to enforce discipline, executing the weakest, bellowing that cowardice and malingering would not be tolerated. But no bolt round could silence the truth of the plague. The regiments that should have defended the city died behind their walls before they ever saw battle. Meanwhile, the governor's palace became both fortress and prison. The planetary governor, Lord Helbrecht, refused to appear before the people, hiding behind the gilt doors of his spire. He called for aid through astropathic channels. His desperate pleas whispered into the void, requests for Medicae shipments, for regiments, for inquisitorial intervention. No reply came. Whether his messages failed to pierce the warp, or whether the Imperium simply chose not to answer, no one could know. Rumor claimed the astropath choir had gone mad, their minds filled with visions of flies and gardens of rot. Others said the Emperor had turned his gaze away. Whatever the truth, the palace gates shut, guarded by dwindling numbers of household troops, and the people outside were left to die in the streets. By the 60th day, the city was unrecognizable. The air reeked of sewage and decay, rivers clogged with swollen corpses, bridges sagged under the weight of the dead stacked upon them. Flies blackened windows until no light could enter. Entire districts lay abandoned, their doors barred with symbols of the Aquila painted in blood, as if faith alone might hold the sickness at bay. The manufactura had fallen silent, their machines choked with rust and filth, conveyor belts crawling not with laborers, but with larvae. And still, the denial lingered. The administratum continued its ledgers, the ecclesiarchy continued its sermons. The governor continued to broadcast hollow reassurances from his palace vox systems, promising order, promising a cure, promising that the emperor would provide. But the people knew, even if no one dared to say it aloud. Every soul in the city felt the truth. They were already dead, and their world with them. By the time the plague had finished its slow march through the veins of Corythus, the city no longer resembled anything imperial. Its towers still stood, its walls still cast shadows across the ruins, but inside, life itself had changed. The fever no longer left its victims hollowed and weak. It reshaped them, flesh bloated with fluid, skin cracked open to release rivers of pus. And the boils that had once dotted the sick now swelled into grotesque tumors that pulsed as if with their own heartbeat. Men and women coughed not only blood but worms, and their eyes filmed over with a milky sheen, as though something inside them was watching the world through rotted glass. The streets became hunting grounds. Those too far gone staggered through alleys, driven not by hunger but by something deeper, a need to spread, to touch, to carry their corruption into every space left untouched. They spoke in broken murmurs, words that no lexicon recognized, their voices carrying the cadence of liturgy, though the meaning was alien. Some knelt in the gutters, as if in prayer, whispering into the buzzing clouds of flies. And the flies answered, landing on their mouths, crawling into their throats, moving as if obeying some unheard command. The Astra Militarum attempted containment. At first they fought with discipline, forming cordons around infected zones, erecting barricades of ferrocrete and sandbags, laying down sheets of less fire into advancing mobs of the diseased. But the mobs did not retreat. They did not feel pain. Those struck down rose again, dragging themselves forward with ruined limbs, their blood carrying contagion that spattered into the faces of the defenders. Whole platoons were lost without a shot fired at an enemy soldier, lost because one man coughed, because one hand brushed another in the press of battle lines. There were no front lines anymore. Every trench, every bunker, every mess hall became a place where infection seeped unseen until the regiment itself collapsed into madness. Commissars executed mercilessly, bellowing catechisms of purity as their bolt pistols thundered, but it made no difference. The guard did not die as warriors, they died as hosts. And in their dying, they swelled with unnatural strength, their bodies tearing apart their flak armor as they staggered back into the ranks of their former comrades. A squad could be intact 1 hour, and a horror the next. Lasgons falling silent as hands twisted into claws, as teeth fell out and were replaced by jagged growths of bone. It was not a war that could be won. It was rot given legs, faith given disease, death given voice. From the precinct fortresses of the Arbites to the spires of the noble houses, there was no safe haven. Quarantines collapsed. Officers and governors locked their doors, but the plague seeped through walls, through air ducts, through the water that ran in golden cups. The city itself seemed to shift. Sewer tunnels bloated with filth until they overflowed into the streets, and from their mouths came shapes that should not have existed, forms half men, half slime, dragging themselves with the strength of fevered devotion. Citizens whispered that the very stones of the city sweated corruption, that the walls themselves wept foulness like a body lanced open. It was then that the siege truly began. There were no ships in orbit to hammer the city with lance fire. No Xenos army gathered outside the walls. No heretic fleet filled the sky. The enemy was already inside. Every cough, every bead of sweat, every whispered prayer to false salvation was a breach in the defenses. The city was encircled not by tanks or artillery, but by inevitability. Nurgle had no need of bombards. His armies bloomed from the lungs of his victims. His gates opened wherever a heart gave up its strength. By the 95th day, the Astra Militarum had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Regiments became rabble, rabble became swarms, and swarms became something worse. Officers' corpses sat slumped in their command chairs, their flesh liquefying into pools that birthed crawling shapes. Vox operators babbled in tongues that carried static through every channel, filling the ears of listeners with laughter that did not belong to any human throat. In some barracks, soldiers nailed their helmets to their own heads, screaming that they could not let the rot inonely to collapse hours later, their armor rattling with the buzzing of flies trapped inside. The city was no longer defended, it was consumed. When the last vestiges of resistance on Carithus collapsed, silence did not follow. Something worse did. The stillness of death, the quiet of mass graves, never arrived. Instead, the world began to change, as though reality itself was soft clay, pressed and reshaped by a hand that no human could see. It did not happen in an instant, nor did it come as the thunder of orbital bombardment might. It was a slow, unmaking, and unfolding corruption, patient and obscene in its inevitability. The forests beyond the Manufactura plains thickened first. What had been sparse groves of twisted ironwood trees erupted into sprawling jungles of fungus. Their caps rose higher than hab towers, their stalks dripping with oozing ichor, their roots crushing ferrocrete roads until the avenues of man were swallowed whole. Spores fell like snow, coating the ground in a slick green film, and anyone who walked among them emerged hours later, unrecognizable, skin blistered, lungs filled with moss, eyes sprouting stalks that swiveled as if searching for light. What had once been trees became organs of disease, pulsing in rhythm with the endless drone of flies. The oceans followed. Corythus seas, long poisoned by runoff from Manufactura, began to bubble and seethe as though alive. Fish rotted in mid-swim, their bodies splitting open to release wriggling masses of new life that should never have been born. Waves rolled thick with slime, carrying shapes that no sailor could name. Creatures with too many mouths, crustaceans whose shells beat like hearts, serpents that bled from their own scales. The stench of salt and rot carried inland until even those who never glimpsed the shoreline gagged at its reek. The water cycle itself had become an engine of plague, raining filth across every district, and in the Manufactura, where once machines had roared with the labor of billions, something impossible occurred. The smokestacks did not fall silent. They changed. No longer did they belch ash and fire. Now they spewed swarms of flies. Black clouds poured forth in such density that they eclipsed the sun, turning midday into dusk. The sound was constant, a living thunder as wings beat against one another, their bodies forming rivers in the sky. They crawled across walls, filled the mouths of statues of the Emperor, draped themselves over the banners of the Imperium until even the Aquila itself seemed nothing but a silhouette beneath a crawling shroud. People who still clung to life heard laughter. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a deep and gurgling mirth that echoed in the throats of the dying, bubbling up from lungs half filled with mucus. Some claimed to see shapes in the haze, corpulent figures waddling through the streets, their bellies split with smiling maws, their arms dripping with pus. Demons. They slipped through wounds in the veil, where the barrier between real space and the warp had thinned to a film. At first they were glimpses, shadows on the edge of vision, but soon they walked openly. Nurglings tumbled from rotting corpses like parasites, giggling as they gnawed at flesh. Plague-bearers stalked the avenues, tallying souls in croaking voices, their parchment tongues scratching numbers into the air. And behind them, greater things loomed, indescribable hulks that seemed both corpulent and skeletal, dripping gifts of decay upon everything they touched. Corythus was no longer a world of man. It was not even a corpse world, lifeless and still. It was something alive, though its life was wrong. It had been folded into the garden of Nurgle, its soil claimed, its seas turned to cauldrons, its air to buzzing him. It was not erased but rewritten, converted into a shrine of decay that would persist for eternity. The faithful of the plague god called it a blessing. Where the Imperium saw ruin, they saw perfection. Where the Administratum's ledgers ended, they believed the tally had only just begun. When the Imperium returned to Corythus, it was not with fanfare or triumph. There was no liberation fleet, no cheering crowds awaiting salvation. There were only battle barges and extermination orders. For by then the world had already become a name etched into Administratum archives as lost. Decades had passed, perhaps centuries by the distortion of warp roots, but time mattered little. To those who set foot upon its surface, the fall of Corythus felt fresh, as though the plague still lingered in the lungs of the present moment. The ruins breathed. The soldiers of the new expedition noted it first, air that seemed alive, carrying not just dust, but spores that shimmered in the light of their helmet lamps. Every inhalation tasted faintly of copper and rot, filtered though their rebreathers could not cleanse the sensation. The wind whispered across shattered Manufactura, yet the whispers were not like the ordinary moan of broken stone. They carried rhythm, a cadence that wove itself like chanting low, reverent, almost prayerful. Some swore they heard laughter threaded through the sound. a bubbling mirth that mocked the silence. The ruins themselves defied categorization. Ferrocrete towers had not merely collapsed. They had softened, sagging into shapes that resembled melted wax. Statues of the Emperor had become unrecognizable, their features swollen with tumors of stone, their eyes dripping with moss that wept foul water. The oceans were stagnant basins of sludge, steaming faintly even under cold skies, alive with movements beneath their crusted surfaces. Forests stood as petrified monuments of fungus, their trunks hollow, their interiors crawling with swarms that scattered when light intruded. Even the ground gave beneath armored boots like flesh too long left to rot. The expedition brought with them vox recorders, as ordered, and what they captured spread unease even among hardened veterans. The machines did not only record the sound of their footsteps or the murmur of their voices. They captured other things, whispers that echoed where no human throat had spoken, tally marks scratched into static, laughs that emerged from the dead air, repeating until they distorted into sobs. Some said the Vox itself was infected, that corruption could seep not only through blood and soil, but through sound, through memory, through anything that dared to bear witness. What lingered in the memories of survivors, those few who had fled before the plague had fully consumed the planet, was little different. They spoke of dreams that did not fade, of coughs that echoed in their lungs long after their bodies were declared free of disease. They described hearing their names called in voices that were not human, feeling unseen hands press upon their shoulders in the dark. The ecclesiarchy branded these survivors tainted, cursed, dangerous to faith. Some were burned as examples, their deaths offered as proof that the Emperor's light alone could scour Nurgle's shadow. Others were forced into pilgrimages, endless journeys to holy sites, in the hope that movement itself would cleanse them of what clung to their souls. None found peace. The administratum, ever pragmatic, filed Charithus under sealed records. Its death teeths were calculated, its projected value erased, its charts marked with a single word, Exterminatus, pending. Whether the order was ever executed is another matter, for the world remained on star maps, in scattered archives, sometimes noted as a barren husk, sometimes marked as unfit, sometimes erased altogether. The inconsistency itself spoke volumes. The Imperium did not wish to remember Charithus, yet it could not forget. The ledger was haunted by its absence, and the Ecclesiarchus's priests, who once thundered sermons against impurity, shaped the story to fit their needs. In some sects, Charithus was spoken of as a punishment for doubt, proof that the Emperor's tests would burn the unfaithful from his sight. In others, it became a parable of false endurance, a warning that no mortal will could resist the touch of the ruinous powers. But in hushed corners, whispered only in cloisters, where the torches burned low, some dared to ask a darker question. What if Charithus had not been punished? What if it had been chosen? What if the grandfather's laughter echoed, not as mockery, but as ownership proof that the universe itself could be rewritten into joy of a kind the Imperium could never understand? For the Imperium, the silence of Charithus was unbearable because it was not empty. It hummed with the echo of the song that had claimed it, a melody of rot and renewal that lingered in stone, in wind, in memory. To burn such a world was to silence the voice, but silence was not victory. Silence left the doubt. How many more planets carried the same note, waiting to be heard? How many more lungs coughed in Manufactura, far across the stars, their first rattles already marking them for the garden? The fleets that came and went from Charithus carried more than reports. They carried unease. They carried spores, clinging unseen to armor seals, to the grooves of lasguns, to the parchment of ecclesiarchal writs. No Exterminatus could cleanse thought. No pyre could burn memory. And in the long quiet of space, when soldiers closed their eyes, they swore they heard it still, the laughter of the plague god, echoing softly, endlessly, as though it had never left. The fate of Charithus, is not an exception, it is a pattern. The Imperium is filled with countless worlds, each one bound by the same fragile thread of faith and labor. Each one cough, one whisper, one prayer away from being claimed. To lose a planet to fire is tragedy, but to lose it to rot is something deeper, because the wound never fully closes. It lingers, festering in the memory of those who return, haunting the ledgers of scribes, twisting the sermons of priests. For every shrine raised to the Emperor's glory, there are places like Corythus where his light never returned, where silence itself became a hymn to another god. That is what Nurgle leaves behind, not victory, not conquest, but permanence. A world remade, a song that never ends, a lesson etched into the bones of the galaxy. Nothing is too strong to decay, nothing too sacred to wither, nothing too human to be forgotten. The Imperium can burn such places, scour them from maps, even strike their names from record, but still, the echo remains. It hides in the air, in the dreams of survivors, in the doubt that no decree can silence. And so the story of a single cough in a crowded hablog becomes something larger than one man, one family, one city. It becomes the story of how fragility defines the Imperium itself. For in the end, every fortress can crumble, every fleet can fail, and every world can drown, not in fire, not in battle, but in silence after the song has finished.